Hello and welcome back to another video on my channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at the recent developments with the transgender military member ban. And so this actually starts in January of last year in 2025 with President Donald Trump's executive order that is prohibiting participation in the military for transgender individuals. In this article, what is their justification and what is actually required of the administration to make a change such as this? So let's go ahead and get right into it. For those who are unfamiliar or unaware of the recent updates, the DC Circuit recently pressed the government for a justification of this transgender ban regarding the military service. U.S. Circuit Judge Wilkins asked the government's attorney where Hegseth has rationalized his decision to get rid of an exception that allowed certain service members diagnosed with gender dysphoria to continue serving in the military. The rule, as the judge states it here, is essentially this. You have to first acknowledge that you're changing it, and second, give a rational explanation for the change. Now, where is he getting this from? We'll get to that later. Now here, Judge Wilkins points out something. James Mathis knew all the costs, knew all the risks, but said based on reliance of interest, the investment, service, we're essentially willing to take that risk of continuing to have transgender individuals serve in our military. Now, the DOJ attorney Campbell said before, service members with gender dysphoria seek mental health treatment more than service members without gender dysphoria, and that should be the justification for changing course, changing policy on this issue. Now, Judge Wilkins was not really buying it, and he says that Hegseth's policy fails to consider something more specific, how trans service members who were allowed to stay in the military under Mathis's policy have performed and what costs they have posed as a result. So instead of this broad study looking at transgender individuals versus people without that gender dysphoria and who seeks mental health care more often, he says that it should be more tailored to an analysis useful to the military. And without that, he's not satisfied that the analysis of Mathis should be overturned because this analysis doesn't seem deep enough. Now, following the January executive order from President Donald Trump, in February of last year, there was a new policy disqualifying from service anyone who is not willing to identify with their birth sex and has ever attempted to transition or has had symptoms in the past 3 years of gender dysphoria. So under the current rules, we can see what the judges are focused on, and it's going to come down to this bottom line. The government has provided nothing to show that service members with gender dysphoria undermine military preparedness like it is claiming. So let's go ahead and look at the case law, which is going to show why the court and the judges are so focused on these things. The relevant case here, and for anyone who is in law school or has gone through law school and did a statutory interpretation class, something that is widely taught is the State Farm case. It comes from 1983, and it's a very interesting case, and essentially it stands for a few things, but before we get into that, let's start with what led up to it and the background of this case. So Congress enacted the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966, and essentially what they're looking to do is they run a bunch of studies and they see how can we create regulations that are going to keep Americans safer on the roads. And so they fund this huge study. It takes many years to produce, and as a result they have their vision in mind. And what happens is Ronald Reagan runs on a campaign of being against regulations. They're going to fight regulations, cut costs, and make the American economy more efficient, and they're going to simplify things. So when they get into office, they overturn what was a very rigorous study, years worth, lots of money to fund it, and they're going to get rid of it. That gets challenged, and one of the rules that the court comes away with is this. Rules and regulations cannot be arbitrary and capricious. There needs to be a basis for implementing them or creating them in the first place. And what they decide is that you need to have studies and things of that nature that are going to justify the policy decision. So as a result, if that's what it takes to create and implement a new rule, well then the standard for getting rid of the old rule should be the same. Here the court says revocation constitutes a reversal of the agency's former views as the proper course. A settled course of behavior embodies the agency's informed judgment that by pursuing that course, it will carry out the policies committed to it by Congress. Accordingly, an agency changing its course by rescinding the rule is obligated to supply a reasoned analysis for the change. Here's the standard. The agency must examine the relevant data and articulate a satisfactory explanation for its action, including a rational connection between the facts found and the choice made. This is highlighting and showing us why the courts are so focused on the justifications and what information was relied upon in coming to the conclusion that transgender individuals cannot serve in the military. Now, what I find most interesting about the State Farm case from 1983, and I think a lot of people do, at least when I was in class, I remember us spending a lot of time talking about this, it's this idea that elections have consequences. And what Justice Rehnquist says in his dissent in part, he states that the agency changed view of the standard seems to be related to the election of a new president of a different political party. It is readily apparent that the responsible members of one administration may consider public resistance and uncertainties to be more important than do their counterparts in a previous administration. A change in administration brought about by the people casting their votes is a perfectly reasonable basis for an executive agency's reappraisal of the costs and benefits of its programs and regulations. As long as the agency remains within the bounds established by Congress, it is entitled to assess administrative records and evaluate priorities in light of the philosophy of the administration. Elections have consequences. If this case gets taken by the Supreme Court, I think there's a big chance, there's a real chance that this dissent might be adopted and it might be expanded with something taken of the old rule that State Farm laid out. But I think also what's gonna play into this case is the fact that this is in the context of the military. There is a lot of discretion given to the military by the courts, and so these two things might come in combination to see the Trump administration ultimately win out in this issue if it were to go to the Supreme Court, but anything can happen. There you have it. Those are the recent updates on where this ban is at, where it is likely heading, and why the courts are focused on what they're focused on, so you can have more information when you're thinking about this, thinking about the role the judges are playing, thinking about how the government is handling it, and how this will likely shake out. I hope you learned something. I hope you found it interesting. I'm not trying to tell you what to think. I think I've kept my opinion out of this and covered it pretty fairly, but I'm sure you guys will, as always, let me know in the comments down below. Take care, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.